In the spring of 1820, a tenant farmer tilling the fields near the Delaware-Maryland border stumbled upon a discovery that would pull back the curtain on one of America's most horrifying criminal networks. As his plow horse trudged through the soil, the ground suddenly gave way beneath its hooves, revealing a rotting wooden chest buried just below the surface. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a man, his bones stained with time and his skull marked by unmistakable traces of violence. That grim find was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, investigators would uncover the remains of at least 7 victims on the same property. Among them 3 children. All had fallen prey to a woman whose name had already become synonymous with fear across the Delmarva Peninsula, Martha Petty Cannon. For nearly 20 years, Cannon oversaw what historians now call the Reverse Underground Railroad, a sinister enterprise that kidnapped free African Americans and runaway slaves, selling them back into bondage throughout the Deep South. But Cannon's crimes went beyond human trafficking. She was also a murderer, known to kill rival traders, witnesses, and even children whenever they posed a threat to her operations. Official court documents from Sussex County, Delaware, charged her with 4 murders, yet eyewitnesses insisted the true number was well over 20. Before delving deeper into the chilling saga of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I'd like to hear from you. Where are you listening from today? Cannon's shadow stretched far beyond her Delaware base, leaving its mark on communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Drop your location in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe and tap the notification bell, because these dark, forgotten pages of American history deserve to be remembered. The discovery of those buried skeletons would ultimately unravel a vast criminal network that had thrived for over a decade, shielded by legal loopholes, racial prejudice, and the cruel reality that most of its victims were people whose disappearances drew little attention from white society. The region where Patty Cannon built her empire of fear was perfectly suited for lawlessness. In the early 1800s, the settlement now known as Reliance sat at the crossroads of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This peculiar geography meant criminals could evade arrest simply by crossing a line into another county or state. Locals once called it Johnson's Crossroads, after a tavern that later became the nerve center of the most infamous kidnapping ring in U.S. history. The landscape itself seemed almost designed for secrecy. Endless stretches of pine and oak forest cloaked the region, broken only by swampland and small patches of cleared farmland. The Nanticoke River snaked quietly through these woods, offering a hidden route for transporting captives under the cover of night. Rough wagon trails served as the only roads, and the nearest major town could take days to reach on horseback. For anyone wishing to stay beyond the reach of the law, it was an ideal place to disappear. Martha Cannon, known to acquaintances as Patty, arrived in this isolated borderland sometime around 1790. Records suggest she was born about 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though her true origins remain uncertain. Some sources claim she was born in Canada and migrated to Delaware at 16. What is certain is that she married Jesse Cannon, a quiet local farmer who owned land straddling the state line. Together they raised at least 1 daughter and appeared to live a modest, uneventful rural life. Jesse Cannon was remembered as a reserved man tending his fields of tobacco and corn like many settlers of his time. Their homestead stood on a small patch of land that crossed from Delaware into Maryland, a detail that would later prove central to Patty's criminal schemes. The house itself was a simple 2-story wooden structure, typical of the era, with thick plank walls and narrow windows. Yet within those walls, hidden spaces and secret chambers were eventually constructed to imprison kidnapped victims. Beneath the outward calm of their farm life, a far darker reality was taking shape. The early 1800s were a turning point in the American slave trade. After Congress outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the booming cotton industry of the Deep South created a desperate demand for enslaved labor. A healthy adult enslaved man who once sold for $300 before the ban could now fetch over $1,000 in states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. The explosion of cotton production following the invention of the cotton gin fueled this hunger for labor. And for criminals like Patty Cannon, it meant enormous profit. What had begun as the promise of a new agricultural economy soon devolved into one of America's most sinister and forgotten chapters. A network of greed, cruelty, and murder that thrived in the shadows of a divided nation. The federal prohibition on importing enslaved Africans had transformed the nature of slavery in America. With the Atlantic slave trade outlawed, the only way to acquire new enslaved people was through domestic means, either by natural population growth or through the capture and re-enslavement of free African Americans. No region was more vulnerable to this new wave of predation than the Delmarva Peninsula. After the Revolutionary War, many slaveholders in Maryland and Delaware had emancipated their enslaved laborers, either in response to gradual abolition laws or through private acts of manumission. As a result, the area became home to a significant population of free black men and women, farmers, artisans, and day laborers who built independent communities on the margins of white society. Yet their freedom was tenuous. These citizens lived under constant threat, with few allies in power and little protection from the law. Their disappearances often drew no serious inquiry, dismissed by white authorities who considered them less than fully human. The legal status of free African Americans in the early 1800s was fragile at best. Though no longer enslaved, they were denied many of the basic rights afforded to white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom was conditional, subject to challenge at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their legal status, a document that could be stolen or destroyed with ease. For criminals like Patty Cannon, these vulnerabilities created a perfect climate for exploitation. It was into this landscape that Patty Cannon emerged, a woman who would prove that evil was not confined to men. Contemporary accounts describe her as a large, commanding figure, nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women stood little more than 5. Neighbors recalled her deep, harsh voice and her volatile temper, traits that made her presence both feared and respected. She possessed a kind of physical authority rare among women of her time, and when angered, she was said to be capable of terrifying rages. Her husband, Jesse Cannon, died under mysterious circumstances around 1826. Whispers spread that she had poisoned him, though no formal charge was ever brought. With Jesse's death, Patty gained full control of the family's property, and by then, she had already begun forging the criminal alliances that would soon make her infamous. Law enforcement in the rural borderlands of Delaware and Maryland was almost non-existent. The few officers who served the region were often poorly funded, easily bribed, or simply too overwhelmed to deal with organized crime. Social conditions only made matters worse. The white population was sparse and transient, consisting mostly of small farmers, drifters, and those seeking a fresh start far from the scrutiny of established communities. There was little sense of collective responsibility, and most neighbors preferred to mind their own affairs, no matter what suspicions they might harbor. That isolation, and the indifference it bred, would prove vital to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for nearly 2 decades. The transformation of Patty Cannon from a seemingly ordinary frontier widow into a criminal matriarch began with her daughter's marriages, setting into motion a pattern that would define the next 20 years. Both of her daughters married men involved in the kidnapping trade. The first, Henry Brereton, was a blacksmith by profession, but his true income came from abducting free African Americans and selling them into slavery in the Deep South. In 1811, Brereton was arrested in Georgetown, Delaware, for kidnapping but managed to escape from jail later that same year. His criminal reputation was well known long before his arrest. As a traveling blacksmith, Brereton had a legitimate reason to visit remote farms and settlements, repairing tools and shoeing horses. This mobility gave him the perfect cover for scouting potential victims. During his travels, he would quietly note which families had teenagers or young adults who might fetch high prices in southern slave markets. The methods used by early kidnappers like Brereton were crude but devastatingly effective. They relied on a combination of trickery, brute force, and isolation. One common tactic was to approach free black families with offers of well-paying work in distant towns or plantations. Parents, desperate for opportunity, would often allow their sons or daughters to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had been sold into bondage hundreds of miles away. It was after Brereton's escape that the first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred. Working alongside Patty Cannon and another known criminal, Joseph Griffith, Brereton helped orchestrate an ambush against a slave trader known only as Rigidal at Cannon's Tavern. Their plan was brutally straightforward: get the victim drunk, rob him of his slaves and money, then kill him to silence any witness. According to court records, Rigidal was shot and killed during the robbery. Both Brereton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Patty Cannon escaped prosecution, likely shielded by corrupt officials and jurisdictional confusion. The Rigidal murder marked a turning point, the moment when Cannon's criminal network evolved from small-scale trafficking into a coordinated operation built on violence, deception, and fear. From that point on, the Cannon property was no longer just a rural homestead. It had become the nerve center of one of the most dangerous enterprises on the American frontier. Before the Rigidal murder, the Cannon family's criminal involvement had centered mostly on kidnapping and providing a safe refuge for fugitives passing through the border region. But the willingness to commit cold-blooded murder for profit marked a new level of brutality, one that would define every stage of Patty Cannon's future empire. Contemporary newspaper reports of the Rigidal case described the crime in chilling detail. The victim, a slave trader, had been traveling through the area with a considerable sum of money, between $3,000 and $5 an ounce, intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He stopped at what appeared to be a respectable roadside tavern, seeking a meal and lodging for the night, unaware that he had just walked into a carefully laid trap. Throughout the evening, the conspirators, Brereton, Griffith, and Cannon, entertained him with drink and conversation, deliberately plying him with alcohol as they waited for the right moment. When Rigidal finally retired to his room, the two men followed. Later, neighbors recalled hearing raised voices, a scuffle, and finally the sharp crack of a gunshot echoing across the dark countryside. By morning, Rigidal was dead. His money and belongings had vanished, along with his wagon and horses. His body was buried hastily on the property, the first of many such secret graves that would turn Cannon's land into a graveyard of her victims. The execution of her daughter's first husband, Henry Brereton, did nothing to curb Cannon's ambitions. If anything, it hardened her resolve and taught her important lessons about how to refine her methods. The mistake, she decided, had not been in committing the crime, but in failing to organize properly. From that point forward, her focus shifted toward building a more disciplined, better coordinated criminal network, one capable of surviving even when individual members were captured or executed. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Patty found in him the perfect partner, a man who possessed not only the ruthlessness required for their trade, but also the business acumen to expand it. Johnson wasn't merely another kidnapper. He was a strategist, a trafficker who understood the logistics of moving human beings across state lines. He had connections across the South, access to buyers in major slave markets, and enough capital to turn Cannon's crude operations into a regional enterprise. Together, Cannon and Johnson turned their sights to a new property, a tavern perched directly on the Delaware-Maryland border. The building's placement was so precise that its rooms literally stood in two different states. It soon became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, and its location gave the operation a near-perfect legal loophole. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, the suspects could simply step across the threshold into the Maryland section of the building and claim they were outside Delaware's jurisdiction. The tavern was a multi-purpose hub for their growing criminal organization. On the surface, it was a legitimate business, welcoming travelers and merchants who passed through the region. This provided a convenient cover story for the steady traffic of wagons and strangers on the property. Beneath that veneer, however, the tavern served three distinct purposes. It was a holding facility for kidnapped victims awaiting transport south, complete with hidden rooms and underground cellars designed to confine human cargo. It was a gathering place where members of the network met to plan raids, trade captives, and divide profits. And it remained a functional inn whose legitimate income made the enterprise appear above suspicion. The structure's design reflected its dual identity. The main floor looked entirely ordinary. A common room with rough-hewn tables, a bar stocked with rum and whiskey, and several guest rooms for travelers. But below that level lay a secret world. Stone-lined cellars and tunnels extended beneath the building, accessible through concealed trapdoors hidden behind furniture and floorboards. The underground chambers were soundproofed and reinforced, preventing noise or escape. Iron rings were bolted into the walls to secure chains, and narrow ventilation shafts ensured captives could breathe during long periods of confinement. The criminal network surrounding Cannon and Johnson was unusually diverse for its time. It included white accomplices such as Henry Carr, mixed-race decoys like John Purnell, and even enslaved men forced to capture others under threat of punishment. This diversity wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy. African-American members could approach potential victims without arousing suspicion, while their white counterparts handled negotiations and sales with Southern buyers. Among these associates, John Purnell stood out as one of the most useful and dangerous. Described in court documents as a yellow man or mulatto, Purnell's mixed heritage allowed him to move freely between both black and white communities. Using multiple aliases, he could pose as a free black laborer looking for work or as a light-skinned white trader, depending on what the situation demanded. His adaptability made him a skilled scout, identifying vulnerable families and establishing initial contact before the kidnappers struck. By the 1820s, the Cannon-Johnson enterprise had grown into a well-organized network that stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana. Historical records trace confirmed connections to buyers and traders across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. The operation had become so extensive that it eventually drew the attention of Joseph Watson, the mayor of Philadelphia, a Quaker reformer dedicated to protecting free African Americans from being sold into slavery. Watson began to track a series of disappearances among free black citizens of Philadelphia, following the trail southward until it led to the Delmarva Peninsula and directly toward Patty Cannon's stronghold. His reports revealed the horrifying scale of the trafficking ring. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of cases that pointed unmistakably to Cannon's network, evidence of a system that had turned the borderlands of Delaware and Maryland into one of the most dangerous places for free African Americans in the young republic. By 1825, Mayor Joseph Watson's investigation uncovered evidence of dozens of kidnappings directly linked to the Cannon-Johnson gang. These abductions were not random crimes of opportunity. They were carefully calculated, targeting individuals who were the most vulnerable. The gang's victims were chosen with precision. Young adults commanded the highest prices in the southern slave markets. Strong enough for field labor, yet still adaptable to years of servitude. Children, too, were considered valuable commodities. They could be trained for domestic work, molded into obedience, and most importantly, provide decades of profitable labor for their purchasers. This was not chaos. It was a system. The kidnappers maintained what amounted to intelligence files on their victims. They observed local families, noting who had recently fallen on hard times, who had lost work, and who might be easily tempted by promises of employment in distant cities. They kept track of isolated roads and rural households, identifying when individuals traveled alone. It was a network that functioned with the precision of a military operation, one built on greed and human suffering. One of the most harrowing accounts of these crimes came from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free black woman abducted in 1825. Her testimony, preserved in court records, stands as one of the most detailed surviving descriptions of the gang's brutality. Smith recounted being kidnapped while walking alone near Philadelphia, overpowered by several attackers and forced into a wagon bound for the Delaware-Maryland border. The journey took several days. She was blindfolded and chained, denied food except for scraps, and beaten whenever she tried to resist. Upon arrival, she was confined first at Patty Cannon's house, then later moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she remained in chains for 5 long months. Smith described a world of near-constant terror, darkness, filth, starvation, and the sickening awareness that she was soon to be transported south with a group of others. She later told investigators that the underground chambers beneath the Cannon and Johnson properties were filled with other captives. Men, women, and children, all bound and separated by gender. They were kept in stifling darkness without sanitation and fed only enough to keep them alive. The cries of the imprisoned, she said, were muffled by thick wooden walls and drowned out by the sounds of wagons and tavern guests overhead. According to her account, the gang's processing methods were disturbingly systematic. The captives were stripped of every personal belonging, including any papers proving their freedom. Their clothes were taken and replaced with coarse garments typical of enslaved laborers. They were assigned false names and fabricated histories, crafted to make them appear as legitimate slaves to buyers in southern markets. Those who protested or tried to cling to their real identities were beaten until they stopped resisting. Smith's rescue, orchestrated by Joseph Watson's abolitionist network, was a rare success story. Her survival and testimony provided crucial evidence that exposed the inner workings of Patty Cannon's human trafficking empire and the conditions endured by its victims. Within the surrounding community, however, the Cannon gang's activities were an open secret. Locals knew that travelers and free black residents sometimes vanished near the property. They knew that wagons arrived at odd hours and that Johnson's Tavern often hosted meetings behind closed doors. Yet few dared to speak out. In a society steeped in racial prejudice, the disappearances of African Americans were seen as unworthy of serious investigation. The complicity of the white population extended beyond silence. Some neighbors actively aided the operation, providing information about potential targets or accepting money to look the other way. Merchants supplied food and goods without question, while corrupt law officers took bribes to ignore reports of suspicious activity. Only when white victims began to vanish did public interest finally stir. The Cannon gang's greed had no limits. They did not restrict their crimes to kidnapping free black citizens. They also began robbing and murdering white slave traders, men who traveled through the area carrying large sums of cash for purchasing enslaved people. These victims, unlike their black counterparts, had influential backers and business partners who demanded investigations when they disappeared. The first known case occurred around 1820, when a slave trader from Georgia, identified in different accounts as Bell or Miller, vanished while passing through the region. He was reportedly carrying $35,000 in cash, an enormous sum intended for slave purchases. His last known stop was Cannon's establishment, and not long afterward, his horse was found in her possession. When questioned, Patty claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of slaves. But the explanation was quickly dismissed as implausible. The disappearance of the Georgia trader marked the beginning of a new and dangerous pattern, one that would ultimately unravel the entire operation. Unlike the kidnappings of free black citizens, these missing slave traders were men of wealth and influence. They had business associates who demanded answers, investors who expected returns, and family members who insisted on justice. As pressure mounted, authorities began taking a harder look at the Cannon-Johnson network, and the mask of legitimacy that had shielded them for years slowly began to crack. What had once been dismissed as rumor and superstition was now revealing itself as one of the most organized and sadistic criminal enterprises in early American history. At Johnson's Tavern, visiting slave traders were often greeted with apparent warmth and hospitality. They would be plied with alcohol, encouraged to relax, and drawn into long conversations about their business dealings, financial holdings, and travel plans. When the moment presented itself, usually late into the night, when their guard was down, these men would be ambushed, murdered, and robbed. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves on or near Cannon's property, and everything they carried, money, goods, and even the enslaved people they transported, was quickly absorbed into the gang's growing enterprise. The profits from these killings were immense. A single trader might be carrying enough cash to fund the operation for months, while the enslaved individuals accompanying them could be resold through the Cannon-Johnson Southern network for additional income. Beyond financial gain, these murders served a strategic purpose, eliminating rivals and maintaining the gang's stranglehold on regional criminal activity. By the mid-1820s, however, the walls were beginning to close in. Pressure mounted from multiple directions. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, now deeply committed to dismantling the operation, began offering substantial monetary rewards for any information leading to arrests. At the same time, Governor John Andrew Schulze of Pennsylvania, often recorded as Schulzer in older texts, initiated cooperation with Southern officials to track kidnapped free citizens who had vanished across state lines. The emerging picture was no longer of isolated incidents, but of a highly organized kidnapping and murder syndicate that had operated for more than a decade under the guise of local respectability. Watson's 500 reward, a massive sum equivalent to several months' wages for an average laborer, finally began to loosen tongues in communities that had long remained silent. Disillusioned associates, dissatisfied gang members, and even a few escaped victims began sharing information with investigators. Yet, as the net tightened, the gang responded in the only way they knew, with greater violence. Instead of scaling back, they turned inward, killing potential witnesses and anyone they suspected of betrayal. Ironically, this attempt to protect their operation by erasing loose ends would become the very act that sealed their fate. The escalation in violence during this period mirrored the deteriorating mental state of Patty Cannon herself. She had built a criminal empire that reportedly earned over 50 zalożen annually, an unimaginable fortune in early 19th century America. But with success came paranoia. Cannon became increasingly unstable, convinced that her own people would one day betray her to the authorities. She began to see threats everywhere, among her neighbors, her business partners, and even within her household. The figure who would ultimately bring about the gang's downfall was a young mixed-race boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had purchased James as a child when he was only 7 years old, raising him within her home and forcing him to assist in her operations. As he grew older, James became a reluctant participant in the gang's activities, often acting as bait to lure unsuspecting free African Americans into captivity. His role was agonizingly complex. As an enslaved child, he had no power to refuse Cannon's commands. Yet as he matured, he developed a profound sense of guilt and horror at the atrocities he was helping to commit. He realized that he was being used to destroy people who looked like him, people who shared his heritage, his fear, and his humanity. This deep moral conflict eventually compelled him to take a terrifying risk, to cooperate with authorities and expose the truth. Cannon maintained control over Cyrus through a mix of psychological manipulation and cruelty. At times, she treated him as if he were a favored servant or even a surrogate child, offering small privileges to win his trust. At others, she would threaten him with severe beatings or promise to sell him to brutal plantation owners in the Deep South if he ever disobeyed her. She convinced him that his survival depended entirely on her goodwill, that betrayal meant certain death. This toxic cycle of fear and dependence kept him loyal for years, even as he witnessed increasingly horrific acts of violence. When James finally broke his silence, his testimony shocked even the most hardened investigators. He described, in chilling detail, multiple murders he had personally witnessed, including the deaths of children. In one particularly horrifying recollection, he recounted seeing Cannon carry a wounded child, still barely alive, wrapped in her apron, only for the child to never return. Cyrus himself was often forced to help bury the victims, his hands complicit in crimes he was powerless to stop. These were not random killings born of rage, but calculated executions. Cannon viewed every person in her custody through a lens of profit and risk. If a child became sick, she ordered them killed rather than seek medical care, fearing that doctors or supplies might draw unwanted attention. Those who resisted, claimed their freedom, or proved too difficult to control were simply eliminated. Even infants born to enslaved women were sometimes murdered if Cannon decided they would be more burden than benefit to her operation. By this stage, the gang's criminal reach extended across multiple states, but their increasingly reckless violence against white victims, particularly rival slave traders, drew the kind of attention that would lead to their downfall. Competition within the illegal slave trade was fierce, and the Cannon gang had gained a reputation for ambushing competitors, stealing their money, and reselling their human cargo for profit. As law enforcement pressure intensified, Cannon became even more desperate. Killing these white traders meant removing witnesses who could testify, but it also meant provoking powerful enemies with influence in business and politics. Her growing ruthlessness, and the decision to escalate violence against men whose disappearances could not be ignored, marked the beginning of the end for the Cannon-Johnson empire. Patty Cannon's empire began to crumble not because of a sudden change in conscience or the persistence of law enforcement, but because of a fundamental miscalculation. For years, she had operated without consequence, confident that her crimes would go unpunished. The murders of free African Americans had never drawn more than passing attention from the authorities, leading her to believe that even killing white victims would carry no repercussions. It was this fatal arrogance, born from long-standing impunity, that finally doomed her operation. In early 1829, the first real evidence of her crimes literally surfaced from the earth. A tenant farmer working one of Cannon's rented parcels made a horrifying discovery while plowing a low, marshy stretch of land that had recently been cleared of brush. His horse stumbled, the ground giving way beneath its hooves. When the man dismounted to investigate, he uncovered the edge of a wooden chest, buried deep in the soil. Upon prying it open, he found human bones, the remains that investigators later identified as belonging to the missing Georgia slave trader who had vanished nearly 10 years earlier. The find triggered a full-scale investigation that would expose the depth of Cannon's brutality. The farmer who made the discovery had been cultivating land that Cannon leased out for extra income. The area was typically avoided because of its tendency to flood, but an unusually dry season had made it suitable for planting. At first, he assumed his horse had stepped into a sinkhole or abandoned well, but as he dug further, the gruesome reality emerged. The wooden chest was in surprisingly good condition, its structure preserved by the damp soil. More chilling still, it had been custom, built to fit a human body, its measurements precise and deliberate. This detail made it clear that the burial was not a panicked concealment, but rather part of a systematic method of corpse disposal that had been perfected through years of practice. The unearthing of that first body in 1829 set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately bring Cannon's decades-long reign of terror to an end. Delaware authorities, working in coordination with officials from Maryland and Pennsylvania, launched a sweeping inquiry into every property linked to the Cannon-Johnson network. What they uncovered was far worse than even the most grim suspicions. The investigation was spearheaded by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, who collaborated closely with Maryland lawmen and representatives from the Pennsylvania governor's office. This multi-state operation was groundbreaking for the early 19th century, a recognition that Cannon's crimes were interstate in scale and demanded unprecedented cooperation among jurisdictions. The search warrants issued were notably broad, giving investigators permission to excavate any area of the Cannon properties where they believed bodies might be hidden. This legal coverage proved essential, ensuring that officers could proceed without fear of accusations of trespassing or unlawful search. Crucially, the warrants also established that any evidence discovered could be used across state lines, closing the jurisdictional loopholes that Cannon's gang had exploited for years. Then, on April 3, 1829, the case took another dramatic turn. Cyrus James, the young mixed-race man who had once been Cannon's enslaved servant and reluctant accomplice, was captured in Delaware. Records suggest he had been attempting to flee the region when apprehended. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a death sentence, James made the defining choice of his life. He agreed to turn state's witness and disclose everything he knew about Patty Cannon's operations. His decision was not driven solely by fear. For the first time, James acted on his own moral conviction. He knew that speaking out would likely result in his own prosecution, as he had been forced to aid in countless crimes. Yet, to remain silent would mean continuing to protect the woman who had enslaved and manipulated him, who had made him complicit in the suffering of his own people. In cooperating, he finally broke free from the web of psychological domination that Cannon had maintained over him for nearly his entire life. What Cyrus revealed shocked even seasoned investigators. His testimony was graphic, detailed, and methodical, recounting murders that spanned nearly a decade. He described how Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Patty Cannon herself had shot the Georgia slave trader during supper at Cannon's tavern. He watched as they carried the body into a wooden chest, the very one later unearthed by the farmer, and buried it under cover of darkness. And that, he warned, was only one of many graves. Cyrus's knowledge was exhaustive. He was able to map out burial sites, name accomplices, and describe routes used for transporting kidnapped victims across state borders. He detailed how the gang forged documents, destroyed identities, and sold captives to buyers in the Deep South, all under the noses of complacent or corrupt local officials. Acting on his information, investigators began excavating the Cannon property in a systematic manner. What they unearthed confirmed the horrifying accuracy of James's testimony. In a garden near the main house, they discovered the remains of a young mixed-race child. According to James, the child and his mother had both been enslaved by Cannon. When Cannon began to suspect that the child's father might have been Azers White, possibly even related to her own family, she had the boy murdered in cold blood. Contemporary accounts of this particular discovery survive only in fragments, but even the limited documentation conveys the sheer brutality of the act. The precision of the burial, the evidence of prolonged confinement, and the deliberate concealment of the bodies painted a picture not of spontaneous violence, but of systematic, calculated evil. Indictments reflected just how thoroughly investigators had built their case. Each count was supported by physical evidence, witness testimony, and corroborating documentation gathered from multiple states. For the first time, the web of violence that Patty Cannon had woven for more than a decade was being fully exposed to the light of justice. Authorities had managed to transform scattered rumors and fragments of fear into a cohesive narrative of systematic murder and exploitation. Despite the strength of the evidence, the news of Cannon's indictment sent shockwaves through the community. For years she had been regarded as untouchable, a woman whose wealth, cunning, and ruthless control over her associates placed her beyond the reach of law enforcement. The mere fact that a grand jury had dared to indict her was seen as a triumph of justice over the culture of silence and corruption that had long protected her. Yet, even as the charges were being read, Cannon maintained an eerie calm, refusing to display any visible emotion. When officers arrived to arrest her at her house near the Nanticoke River, they found her composed and almost dismissive. She reportedly greeted Sheriff Houston with a cold smile and simply said, "I knew you'd come eventually." Her confidence suggested a belief that, even now, she could manipulate the system or intimidate those around her into silence. However, this time was different. The scale of her crimes and the growing involvement of multiple states made it impossible for anyone to shield her from accountability. Cannon was taken to the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware, a small, austere facility that had never before housed a prisoner of her notoriety. Her arrival drew crowds from neighboring towns, with many coming simply to catch a glimpse of the woman whose name had become synonymous with terror along the eastern shore. Inside her cell, she was kept under constant watch as rumors circulated that she might attempt escape or take her own life. While awaiting trial, Cannon's demeanor alternated between arrogance and despondence. Some reports from the period suggest she attempted to bribe guards and local officials, promising them portions of hidden gold in exchange for leniency. Others claim she spent long hours staring silently out the barred window, muttering prayers or curses under her breath. The community's fascination with her downfall grew daily, as newspapers across the region printed lurid details about the discovery of the bodies, the testimony of Cyrus James, and the gruesome evidence found on her property. Meanwhile, prosecutors meticulously prepared their case. Each piece of testimony was cross-referenced with physical evidence, including the unique wooden boxes that had contained the victims' remains. Investigators even managed to locate witnesses who had purchased or delivered lumber to the Cannon property, further establishing the premeditated nature of her crimes. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to portray Patty Cannon not merely as a participant in the illegal slave trade, but as the calculating architect of a vast and deadly enterprise that profited from the suffering of others. The community waited anxiously for the trial that promised to reveal the full extent of Cannon's brutality. However, history would record a grim twist before that could happen. Before she could face formal sentencing, Patty Cannon was found dead in her jail cell. Accounts vary, some claiming she took poison smuggled in by a sympathizer, others insisting she died of natural causes brought on by age and stress. Regardless of the means, her death denied the public the spectacle of a trial, but ensured that her reign of terror ended within the cold walls of the Georgetown jail. Even in death, her legacy haunted the region. The story of her crimes, of the graves discovered in quiet fields, of children and men vanishing into the shadows of her enterprise, would continue to echo through the communities of Delaware and Maryland for generations. Her demise marked not only the end of one of the most infamous criminal operations of the early 19th century, but also a turning point in how law enforcement and society confronted the horrors of human trafficking and murder. If you followed this dark journey so far, stay tuned. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how the aftermath of Cannon's death shaped new laws, inspired public outrage, and finally brought justice, however delayed, to the countless victims of her crimes. The charges against Patty Cannon underscored the depth and precision of the investigation carried out by law enforcement. Unlike most criminal prosecutions of the early 19th century, which often hinged on unreliable witness statements or circumstantial details, the case against Cannon was founded on a powerful combination of physical evidence, corroborating witnesses, and direct confessions from a participant who possessed first-hand knowledge of her crimes. This formidable mix made any form of legal defense virtually impossible. At the center of the prosecution stood Cyrus James, whose harrowing testimony became the cornerstone of the state's case. Once a victim himself, forced into criminal servitude as a child, James now emerged as the key to dismantling the monstrous enterprise that had enslaved and murdered countless innocents. His detailed recollections of the gang's activities, coupled with his ability to guide investigators to burial sites, elevated him to the status of the most consequential witness in Delaware's legal history. Leading the prosecution was Attorney General James Rogers, a respected and determined figure known for his ability to handle complex and politically sensitive cases. Rogers understood that this trial was not merely about bringing a murderer to justice. It was a defining moment for Delaware's legal system, a chance to prove that the law could transcend race, gender, and social privilege. He was determined to show that even someone as feared and influential as Patty Cannon could not operate beyond the reach of justice. Cannon herself, however, remained an enigma. Contemporary newspaper reports depicted her as an imposing, broad-shouldered woman with an air of command that intimidated even seasoned criminals. By the time of her arrest, she was nearing 70 years of age, yet her mind remained sharp, her will unbroken, and her sense of superiority undiminished. Eyewitnesses described her as entirely unrepentant, a woman who regarded her crimes as legitimate business ventures rather than moral abominations. She appeared genuinely bewildered that anyone would prosecute her for what she saw as ordinary acts committed against people she did not recognize as human beings. Her imprisonment at the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware, reflected both the gravity of her offenses and the novelty of her case. The small stone jail, built decades earlier to confine debtors and petty thieves, was ill-equipped to hold a dangerous and high-profile prisoner. Authorities responded by posting armed guards around the clock, reinforcing her cell with iron bars, and implementing strict visitation restrictions. Even in confinement, officials feared she might either attempt escape or face retaliation from remnants of her old gang. During her final weeks behind bars, Cannon reportedly began to speak more openly about her long criminal career. According to surviving records and press accounts, she admitted to killing at least 24 people, including enslaved men, women, and children, as well as rival traders and anyone who threatened her operations. What horrified her interrogators most was not the number of murders, but the cold detachment with which she recounted them. She discussed killings as if describing routine business matters, speaking of disposing of bodies or silencing witnesses with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested no trace of guilt or empathy. Her chilling confessions hinted that what had been discovered on her property was only a small portion of a much wider network of crimes. She described murders stretching back to the early 1810s, kidnappings across state lines, and dealings with collaborators throughout the South. Investigators soon realized that Cannon's operations had been far more extensive and organized than anyone had imagined, involving hundreds of victims trafficked through a network of corrupt intermediaries. Given the overwhelming evidence and mounting public outrage, the court system moved unusually fast. A trial was scheduled for late May 1829, with execution expected shortly thereafter upon conviction. Legal scholars, journalists, and curious citizens across Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania prepared to witness what was expected to be one of the most sensational trials in early American history. Newspapers from Philadelphia and Baltimore sent correspondents to Georgetown, eager to document every detail of the proceedings that would finally bring Patty Cannon to justice. But fate had other plans. On the morning of May 11, 1829, less than 3 weeks before her scheduled trial, jailers discovered Cannon lifeless in her cell. The official report declared suicide by poison, though the true circumstances were never fully verified. Some believed sympathizers had smuggled arsenic into her cell. Others claim she had been secretly collecting small doses of medicine to create her own lethal concoction. The news of her death spread rapidly, stunning both the public and officials who had devoted months to preparing her prosecution. What was meant to be a landmark moment in American criminal justice instead ended in ambiguity and frustration. Yet, even in death, Patty Cannon's shadow loomed large, a chilling reminder of human cruelty and a symbol of how long justice can take to triumph over corruption and fear. Her demise closed one of the darkest chapters in Delaware's history, but it also paved the way for significant changes in law enforcement, inter-state cooperation, and public awareness about the horrors of human trafficking. And though she escaped the gallows, the memory of her crimes would linger for generations, a grim warning etched into the collective memory of the Eastern Shore. When guards made their routine morning inspection, they found Patty Cannon lifeless on the cold stone floor of her jail cell, having apparently died sometime during the night. There were no signs of struggle, the cell door was still locked from the outside, and nothing inside appeared disturbed. The only clue to what had transpired was a small glass vial discovered hidden in her clothing, which, upon examination, was found to have contained arsenic. How Cannon had obtained the poison remained an enduring mystery that investigators never conclusively solved. Security at the Georgetown jail was rudimentary by modern standards. Visitors were rarely searched thoroughly, and the flow of guards and attendants made it easy for contraband to pass unnoticed. Authorities suspected that someone sympathetic to Cannon had smuggled the poison to her during a visit, though no one was ever identified or charged. Some contemporaries believed that Cannon had planned her suicide from the moment she was arrested. Having once witnessed the execution of her own son-in-law, she knew exactly what awaited her after conviction. To her, dying by her own hand may have been preferable to the public humiliation of hanging, allowing her to maintain control over her destiny until her final breath. Cannon's death denied many victims' families the justice they had long awaited, but it also marked the definitive end of one of early America's most organized and ruthless criminal enterprises. Court records confirm that her death effectively dismantled the so-called reverse underground railroad that had plagued the Delmarva Peninsula for nearly 20 years. A network dedicated not to liberating enslaved people, but to kidnapping free black citizens and selling them into bondage in the Deep South. In the immediate aftermath of her death, chaos and frustration gripped Delaware's legal community. Officials had spent months preparing for what was expected to be the most consequential trial in the state's history, and Cannon's suicide left many questions unanswered. Investigators continued probing her connections for months, uncovering scattered evidence of financial transactions, accomplices, and missing persons. But without Cannon's testimony, the full scope of her operations could never be completely reconstructed. As for her remaining associates, their fates diverged. Joseph Johnson, Cannon's son-in-law and key lieutenant, fled to the Deep South, likely Alabama or Mississippi, before the investigation closed in. His brother, Ebenezer Johnson, also vanished, believed to have resumed similar criminal enterprises farther down the Mississippi River. While law enforcement made some nominal attempts to pursue them, the fragmented jurisdiction and sheer distance between states rendered any real prosecution impossible. Only Cyrus James, the mixed-race youth who had been enslaved and coerced into serving the gang, remained to face the justice system. Yet, in a remarkable act of mercy and recognition, Delaware authorities chose to reward his cooperation rather than punish his forced complicity. His courageous testimony had been instrumental in exposing Cannon's crimes, and the courts granted him both freedom and protection. With the help of Northern abolitionists, James was relocated to Pennsylvania, where he assumed a new identity and began rebuilding his life. According to later accounts, he went on to assist with the Underground Railroad, using his insider knowledge of human trafficking routes to help enslaved people escape to freedom, a deeply symbolic reversal of the life he had been forced to lead. The scale of the Cannon-Johnson gang's atrocities became clearer as the investigation unfolded. Historians estimate that the group was responsible for the kidnapping and sale of between 500 and 1,000 free African Americans, trafficking them into the Deep South over nearly 2 decades. The financial gain from these crimes, measured in the value of enslaved individuals sold at southern markets, would amount to millions of dollars in modern currency. Yet no monetary figure could capture the true devastation. Each abduction tore apart a family, destroyed livelihoods, and deepened the scars of racial terror. Entire communities lived in fear, knowing that at any moment, someone might vanish, never to be seen again. The gang's criminal influence stretched from New York to Louisiana, linking them with other shadowy networks engaged in illegal slave trading. Their success was made possible by the fragmented legal systems of early America, where local sheriffs and state authorities lacked both the coordination and resources to confront interstate crime. It was, in many ways, the exposure of Cannon's operations that first highlighted the urgent need for cooperative law enforcement across state lines, a principle that would later become fundamental to modern policing. After her death, Patty Cannon was buried without ceremony in the small graveyard behind the Georgetown jail. The community, still reeling from the magnitude of her crimes, sought no public spectacle, only silence and closure. Decades later, when the jail grounds were redeveloped into a parking area, her remains were moved to a pauper's field near the new prison site. But in a macabre twist emblematic of public fascination with infamy, her skull was separated from her body and displayed in various locations over the years. As late as 1961, it was reportedly on display at the Dover Public Library, a grim relic that both repelled and intrigued onlookers. While such treatment of human remains would be deemed deeply unethical today, it reflected society's lingering obsession with the woman who had terrorized the Eastern Shore. For more than a century, her name evoked both horror and curiosity, a cautionary tale of greed, cruelty, and the unchecked power of lawlessness. In the end, Patty Cannon's legacy extended far beyond her personal crimes. Her story forced Americans to confront the brutal realities of slavery, racism, and the moral blindness that allowed such evil to thrive in plain sight. Though she escaped the gallows, her death did not erase her infamy. It cemented it. To this day, she remains one of the most notorious female criminals in American history, her reign of terror serving as a chilling reminder of what happens when human greed eclipses human conscience. Her story stands as a chilling reflection of the brutal machinery that sustained American slavery, exposing not only the violence inherent in that system, but also the deep vulnerability of free African Americans during the antebellum era. It reveals how cunning and well-connected criminals could exploit gaps in geography and law to commit atrocities on a massive scale. The reverse Underground Railroad she orchestrated was the dark inversion of the networks that guided enslaved people toward freedom, a haunting reminder that for every escape to liberty, there were countless others dragged back into bondage and despair. Even today, historians continue to examine the Cannon case as a striking example of how organized crime could flourish within the legal gray areas of early America. The fact that Patty Cannon's enterprise operated undisturbed for nearly 20 years, despite the suspicions and awareness of local residents, illustrates how racism, economic greed, and weak legal systems combined to let evil thrive unchecked. Her case became a turning point in recognizing the limitations of early 19th century law enforcement. Fragmented jurisdictions, primitive communication, and the absence of trained police forces allowed her network to move people and money freely across state lines. In many ways, the lessons drawn from her crimes later influenced reforms in how interstate crimes were investigated and prosecuted. The impact on the local community was devastating and long-lasting. The region, once known as Johnson's Crossroads, became so tainted by its association with the Cannon Gang that residents eventually changed its name to Reliance, hoping to bury the shame attached to its past. Yet the infamy lingered for generations. Property values plummeted, families moved away, and the name, Cannon, became synonymous with cruelty and deceit. On a broader scale, the Cannon case exposed the moral cracks within the American justice system. The decision to finally pursue legal action against her organization, despite its primarily black victims, marked a small but meaningful shift in public conscience. For one of the first times, authorities acknowledged that all people, regardless of race, were entitled to the law's protection. Though that recognition was fragile and fleeting, it nonetheless represented a step toward the ideals abolitionists had long fought for. The extensive documentation of Cannon's crimes became powerful fuel for the growing abolitionist movement. The sheer organization of her kidnapping ring, and the ease with which free African Americans could be dragged into slavery, offered irrefutable proof of the corruption and moral decay underpinning the entire institution of slavery. Over the decades following her death, Cannon's story transformed into regional folklore. Writers and journalists recounted her deeds, often blurring truth and fiction until the historical record became tangled with myth. One of the most famous retellings appeared in George Alfred Townsend's 1884 novel The Entailed Hat, a sensationalized account loosely based on her life and crimes. The ruins of Cannon's old homestead became a morbid attraction. For decades, curious travelers visited the site, drawn by a morbid fascination with the horrors that had once unfolded there. Locals even built a small trade around the grim tourism, offering tours, selling mementos, and keeping the legend alive. The house itself was finally demolished in 1948, but the site's dark allure persisted, continuing to attract history enthusiasts and curiosity seekers well into the modern era. Ultimately, the Patty Cannon story exposes how easily society can overlook systematic violence when its victims are deemed lesser or invisible. Her reign of terror went unchecked until she began targeting white victims, when the crimes could no longer be dismissed or ignored. It is a grim truth that the same justice system that ignored the suffering of free African Americans only acted when the interests of white citizens were at stake. The legacy of her case serves as both warning and remembrance, a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the dangers of indifference in the face of injustice. It underscores the need for vigilant law enforcement and collective moral responsibility to protect the vulnerable from exploitation. Most importantly, it honors the memory of the hundreds of victims whose names have been lost to history, yet whose pain and stolen lives must never be forgotten. So what do you think? Was the full truth of Patty Cannon's network ever uncovered? Evidence suggests her gang was merely one branch of a far larger web of illegal human trafficking that stretched well beyond the Delaware-Maryland border. Many mysteries remain about the true scale of her operations and the ultimate fate of her victims. If this story intrigued you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more forgotten horrors and true crimes from America's shadowed past, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us next time as we uncover another haunting chapter buried deep within the nation's history.